So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us. We still have people slowly trickling in, so we'll just give it a couple of minutes, maybe 2 more minutes before we get started. It's lovely to see so many friendly faces. Okay, it seems like we're at a stable level of participants. So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nikki Herwanger, and I'm really happy to welcome you to the launch of an exciting publication, which is titled Key Insights from Route-Based Research Along the Main Migratory Routes in the Eastern Horn of Africa. As our very esteemed speakers will explain in much more detail than I will right now, a route-based approach to migration means looking beyond a simple start-to-end path. So as we all know, migrants often face unexpected challenges, delays in transit, changes in destination, or even forced returns. And this means that routes can be fragmented or circular, even bidirectional, and they're shaped by real-time decisions and external pressures. So I guess we can say migration in all its forms is very multifaceted, and our approach really must reflect that. In light of all of this, the research that you will hear about today is part of an evolving body of work within IOM's displacement tracking matrix and regional data hubs. As part of IOM's broader migrant response plans, this work takes a holistic view of mixed migration flows, aiming to improve our understanding of migration from end to end along the entire migration route. It involves in-depth research like what you will hear about today, methodological enhancements to our extensive data collection in the field, partnerships with other experts, both practitioners and academics, and enhancements to our data consolidation, like what you can see in our new flagship. We have a flagship report series called The Global Overview of Migration Routes, which is released 3 times per year and brings together data from all of IOM's regional data hubs. This is just to give you an idea of the broader context in which this research that you will hear about today is situated, but please have a look at the Migrant Response Plan section of the DTM website to learn more. So to begin, I would like to introduce our 2 impressive panelists. First, we have Ms. Laura Nistri, who has worked for IOM in data ecosystems for over 15 years and was recently appointed as the Global Displacement Tracking Matrix Coordinator in 2024. She has extensive experience in designing mobility data monitoring systems and research projects, as well as in launching migration data capacity development activities. In 2018, she led the establishment of the first IOM regional data hub in the Eastern Horn of Africa. Prior to this, Lara was deployed in humanitarian settings in South Sudan from 2011 to 2014 and in Iraq from 2014 to 2017 during the ISIS crisis and Mosul operations. I would then like to introduce our second panelist, Dr. Sandra Sequeira, who is an associate professor in development economics at the London School of Economics. Her research focuses on labor markets, migration, and on developing state capacity for public service delivery in the developing world. She holds a PhD from Harvard University, an MA from Fletcher School, and a BA from Nova University. The structure of our webinar today will be as follows. Laura will share with you the key findings from the research. Sandra will provide a reflection following this, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat or raise your hand during the Q&A session to ask a question. So before I hand over to Laura, please kindly ensure that your mics are muted, and if your camera is on, please make sure it's on intentionally. And with that, enjoy the webinar, and I'll hand over to Laura.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and I will introduce you. Nikki is now supporting the route-based research as well as engagement portfolio as part of the DTM global team, but she has been long supporting and leading the analysis and knowledge and output unit, again, of the DTM global team. I will share presentation. Please confirm, if someone can please confirm that this is visualized well, please.
Yes, we can see it, Laura.
Thank you very much. So thank you so much for this very powerful introduction, and indeed, root-based data collection, as well as more in-depth investigation or analysis related to this complex mixed migration movement are becoming central to the work of the DTM team, but also of the overall organization, IO, of the International Organization of Migration, of IOM, as part of our strategic objective number 3 on promoting regular pathways. Voilà. I will provide few remarks on the concept and rationale behind this root-based approach. I would then introduce the methodology of different phases of this exciting, it was a very rewarding 5 years research project in the eastern Horn of Africa. And then I will fly through the 10 key insights, and I would just invite you to have a look at it when you have time. This was already touched upon by Nikki during the introductory remark, but what we are really trying, and we are not alone, we are many trying to do this, let's also stress that, it is to enhance or advance a more holistic understanding or overview of the migration process. Therefore, the concept of the route in terms of origin, transit, and destination, connecting the various phases of this migration journey that by default are they're not linear, you will see, they're fragmented. They can happen in different phases at different moment of time. Many of them, they may be dependent by different economic, political, social push and pull factor. And they usually, most often involve different categories of people that are on the move together. So we speak about refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants that for different reasons at times, they are moving together along this long migration journey. By default, the complexity of this narrative and the different components and aspects of it require mixed migration, method research approaches in order to being able to capture the complexity, the correlations, and the different characteristics of this journey. And considering how complex, again, these are, they really benefits from partnership, such as now the one that we are establishing with the London School of Economics, and here, and Professor Sandra Sequiera following my intervention, but also by data integration, meaning that no single data source is able to capture or to represent or to provide a comprehensive overview of this very complex, long in distance and in time type of dynamics, and therefore the importance to use operational research, the operational data sources, research data, as well as administrative data sources in order to understand the different components of these trends. Overall, of course, this body of work aims to inform programming and advocacy in order to enhance migrant protection and assistance during the different phases of the journey. As mentioned, this was a very ambitious and fascinating research project that spanned from 2019 to 2023 along the 3 main interregional routes characterizing the eastern Horn of Africa. These are mainly the eastern route, the one who are mostly Ethiopian, that are moving from the Horn of Africa to largely the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, passing through war-torn Yemen. This is comparatively a short route, quite cheap as compared to the others in terms even of cost for the different phases of the journey, and highly bidirectional, because since 2007, there's been different waves. Most recently, since 2017, there are regular forced return and deportation from Saudi Arabia back to Ethiopia. The southern route is going mostly from Ethiopia again, but also Somalia and Eritrea down to South Africa. It's very long. It's by default require far more planning and preparation because it crosses 5 to 6 countries, many of them with restrictive migration policies. Therefore, migration is treated under, irregular migration is treated under criminal law, and far more expensive and time consuming to reach. Finally, we have the northern route, that is the one that from the east and Horn of Africa, again, mostly Ethiopian, but also more Somalis and Eritrean along this route, is the one who connects to both to North Africa and eventually onwards to Europe, and therefore connecting to the central Mediterranean route. And this route, goes without saying, was dramatically affected by the breakout of the Sudan civil war in April 2023 that has completely changed the mobility landscape and dynamics along this route. These are the 10 key messages. Maybe a few remarks on the rationale of this publication. We have published other 13 briefing papers during the different phases of this research project, in collaboration also with different academic institutions or researchers. What we have tried to do in this final publication that we have issued a couple of months ago was really to present the high-level findings. So really to crystallize what were the main learning these phases of this research project. This briefing paper is quite short and is mostly about, reflections on learning, while for more data-driven findings, or anyway, disaggregated aspect of each of the route, we would encourage to go back or anyway to analyze or to read the corresponding publication. I will fly through them as mentioned in the interest of time and given even the complexity and the power of this narrative. First of all, and this is well known, migration drivers are multi-layered and interconnected and context dependent, meaning that there's never a single driver that explains the decision to migrate. In literature and immigration study, usually we speak about macro, meso, and micro level drivers, which, if we look, for instance, in the case of Ethiopia, that has been the main country of origin and focus of this research initiative, we have very powerful macro drivers. The country has been affected cyclically by drought or different natural hazard, conflict and violence. We have recently, so the last one, large conflict, was in Tigray region of Ethiopia, but even without going there, we had other even parts such as Oromia, Amara, different other parts of the country affected by different multiple crises or conflict related dynamics. At the same time, high demographic pressure is is the second largest country in terms of population in Africa, and mostly economic disparity. Therefore, unemployment, underemployment, lack of opportunities and capacity, therefore, to build a sustainable livelihood or to improve or to provide decent living conditions for their families. these macro level drivers that are the main one explaining much of the decision or the desire to change their life, to find, to look for better opportunities, are also compounded by other type of this effect. For instance, in the case of the southern route, we really identify very strong meso-level network dynamics at play between region in the southern of Ethiopia that have really an history of migration to South Africa, where there they have family members or house or community members that were supporting the migrants in this very long journey, supporting them then to find accommodation, to identify a job. In the case instead of the northern routes, what we were really struck, it was fascinating how the drivers were far more mixed in nature. While economic drivers were the primary at the end along the eastern route and the southern route, in the case of the northern route, and this is, I'm speaking before the breakout of the civil war in April 2023, it was evident that there were far more conflict-affected Eritreans and Somali, as well as Ethiopians, and therefore how they were already before the conflict, there was a very large refugee population in Sudan. Sudan, for instance, back then was also a country of destination, not only a country of transit as it became now, and how therefore many of them, they could not go back, for instance, in the case of the Eritreans. So how the narrative there was much more complex and intertwined. And then when the conflict broke out, that has affected then the decision to where move next, where who could afford, where had network and resources, were trying to migrate north, so along the central Mediterranean route, but many others were looking at Uganda, at South Sudan, in order to seek for protection. There are lots of successful stories. Migration is also a very positive and powerful narrative. Remittances that are sent back home increase the livelihood and the capacity of the family to buy a land or to anyway access services, as well as education, as well as better living condition. And community members and other young people mostly can see the impact of how all the positive and the migration dream is changing the life in the community. And we have seen how this plays a very strong influencer in the decision to migrate, or seeing migration as a way in which exactly you can change your life. Social media here play a very strong role that was observed along all the routes through which this image of success or better living condition were shared. At the same time, we also discovered that negative stories such as failed migration attempt or risk related to the migration process tend to be less shared and less discussed. Across all the routes was evident how all these migration processes were far from being linear and easy. Many of them country of destination, such as Sudan, became country of transit. In other cases, we have deportation, spontaneous return process also. So migrants who were set to reach, for instance, Saudi Arabia along the eastern route, and then they would just remain stranded or in the hand of kidnappers. Also, we have story of smugglers in Yemen during the conflict, and then unable to proceed onward, they decided to use the same group or the same network of smugglers to return, to come back mostly to Ethiopia through Djibouti. And this was among the most vulnerable cases, for instance, that we have observed post-COVID, or already started in COVID, but then even more post-COVID, because they had lost all the resources. They didn't reach the final destination. Most often they have also debt bondage. They have asked their families to support in order to proceed or to pay the ransom or the different steps and phases of the journey. And so you can understand how that has further exacerbated their financial situation for them and for the family. Migration networks. This is one of the most fascinating part of this research. It was evident across all the different phases and across all the different routes that we have investigated. Migration networks, as was mentioning before with regard to the southern route, it is community members or family members who have already engage in this migration journey, who share information, share contact with the brokers, share also other support once even they arrive at final destination. Brokers are even part of this process. And in the case of the southern route, we also design a model in order, because it was fascinating how in the southern route, southern part of Ethiopia, engaging in this migration, there were families who had multiple household members that had already engaged in the migration and that were in South Africa, and how the success rate of their migration process was far higher, exactly because they could rely on a solid or more structured support throughout the different phases of that long journey. This is one of the most fascinating findings of the research. While it's well known in literature or overall immigration studies that many people would rather use regular pathways of migration rather than engaging in this long and dangerous and irregular journey, if these were available to them. And we have several study findings talking to this. For instance, along the eastern route, mostly men are engaging in the regular journey. 75% of the flows that were tracked along the shores of Yemen, so just disembark, were men as compared to 25 female. And if you were interviewing men, they were saying, the eastern route, we don't have any pathways accessible for us. All the jobs or opportunities are just for female. Therefore, for domestic work or child care, elderly care, while in reality, in Saudi Arabia, there is a structural demand of low-skilled labor. So there are, as we know, a significant request of labor for construction or for gardening, shepherding. And therefore, the men were saying, this is our only options if we want, to reach these labor opportunities in Saudi Arabia. But there were also female on the move on this route. And the female, they were saying, yes, there are recruitment opportunities, cyclical, so not always, for this type of employments, but we cannot access them because we don't have documents. Sometimes the requirement to have documents are either we don't qualify or they are too expensive, there are too many bureaucratic processes. So at the end, even for them, they were saying for us it's much cheaper and easier just to try and travel irregularly rather than looking for more regular opportunities. And the same, otherwise I'm taking too much time, but the same was even observed as similar stories along the southern route and the northern route, and different type of nuances, of course, across them. Of course, and everyone knows it very well, these journeys are very dangerous, both physically, mentally, different type of abuses and risk that the migrants face. Migrants do not always exercise the full agency throughout all the different, as we know, the different phases of this journey. Most often they are in the hand of more or less well-intended smuggler, meaning that smuggler many of them, they provide a service. Because migrant, for instance, as we said, they would not have other pathways or access or opportunities to reach many of these destinations. So at the end, as we smuggler provide travel services or different type of services in order to support migrants to reach a different destination where usually there are labor opportunities. Economic, as mentioned, is one of the main reason, or the fact that they could then find a job, remit money back home, both to pay the journey as well as to support the family. And so when across all the routes, almost all the migrants that we have interviewed, they were using smugglers. So they were saying that without smuggler, the journey would just not have been impossible. And there were different perceptions about their level of trustworthy or reliance on them. But there were, as I said, far more nuances and complex across the different routes. In reality, migrants knows that these journeys are dangerous or long. So there is a high level of awareness and understanding that this journey entail different risks and abuses. At the same time, there is also a kind of a belief that they would make it, a strong determination that they will somehow be able to overcome the various challenges and reach final destination. And this data point was very high across all the routes. But when migrants decide to engage in this journey, they really have exhausted most of the other options at home. We speak, as mentioned, of very poor context with very limited opportunities. And therefore, when the decision to migrate is taken and all of it, all the resources required, because to migrate is expensive, it's not cheap. Therefore, as we know, they're not the poorer who engage in this type of journey. By that time, there is also very strong, sometimes borderline religious belief that they will be able to reach or somehow to arrive to final destination. And we have monitored a very strong generational divide between the younger, who are far more positive and aspirational, and the old generation who have already went through it or observed even the risk. Unaccompanied children are by default the most unprepared. This is the eastern route. There were many cases of unaccompanied minors who had just decided to migrate without informing their family and just contacted them while en route in order to ask for further money, support, whether to face the journey or, even ransom situation. Gender pattern of migration, fascinating. Please analyze this session, or check it. I've already mentioned the eastern route, but also on the southern route, very long and dangerous. Only men would go by route, by land, while female will rejoin them mostly for marriage and family reunification purpose. At the same time, labor demand at destination is a determinant of which migrants category or migrant sex are on the move on this route. The characteristics of the return process is key to determine the level of the capacity of reintegration back in the society. When a migrant has returned voluntary, maybe has remitted for several years, is very different from someone who has deported, maybe has not reached their final destination, indebted the family, and then may face therefore stigma or isolation back. And here there are in the study links to other large studies that they were conducted under the IOM return and the sustainable return and integration approach that have actually implemented a proper M&E framework to analyze the different social, psychosocial, and economic components of the return and integration. These are the overview of the various publications. As mentioned, in no way I've been able to provide an overview of this complex narrative and findings, but yeah, thank you so much, and I'll pass it to Sandra.
Hi, Sandra. We can see your screen very well, but I think you're on mute still.
Hi, perfect. So you can see the screen and the slides?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here and to share some reflections on root-based research. So I guess I'm just going to echo a lot of what Laura was saying before, but I thought it might be helpful to try to take an overview at why it matters for migration policy, what are the key questions that this type of research can answer, and then I'll end with some kind of reflections on how to make this interface between research and policy more effective. So why does it matter for migration policy? Well, I think Laura just made an excellent case with all the details that she was able to provide based on this research. It helps us identify past patterns and future migration drivers and pressures. It allows us to try to identify what are all the possible protection gaps along a long chain of events and what are the evolving risks on the ground. I think an important point that came through Laura's presentation is this idea that what we know today may not be relevant for what's happening a year from now or 2 years from now. So they're evolving risks. It's a fast-moving setting, and so it's important for research to be able to keep up so that policy is not just misaligned and reactive as opposed to proactive. High quality research can also help us assess trade-offs and assess what is the relative policy effectiveness of different interventions. It allows us to improve targeting, and of course, it allows for course correction, given the complexity of the issues at stake. So why focus on root-based migration in particular? As Laura illustrated with her research, while migrants are in transit along specific routes. About 20%, I think, of most migrants worldwide are going through these well-traveled routes, and they're facing all these dynamic, evolving risks. Their aspirations are shifting throughout their journeys as well. And if we have policies that often focus just on origin or destination, we're going to ignore everything that is happening en route, which in cases of protracted transit migrants is quite problematic because the majority of them may actually be in this state of protracted transit for a long period of time. And so research that focuses on the route as opposed to just the origin and the destination is much better able then to inform protection policies, what are corridors. So as Laura was mentioning, migrants are often moving through very complex, non-linear routes. And what research can do, particularly route-based research, is to just map all the decision points along the way. What are the delays? What are the detours? What are the decisions that people are making across this chain? And this is really critical to detect all types of vulnerabilities that people are exposed to and all the service gaps as well. So why are these gaps so important and so pervasive? Well, it's mostly because of jurisdictional fragmentation. So it's going to create these policy blind spots along the way. There are many challenges with coordinating across countries, the countries of origin, the countries in transit, and the host countries as well. And so what research can do is, again, give us these snapshots or these diagnoses in real time to document where exactly migrants are falling through the cracks in a very complex system. And that can be incredibly useful to try to be a catalyst or to galvanize joint responses and to help us implement cross-border frameworks. So now I would move to just what are several of the questions that route-based research can help answer. And I think once more, the research that Laura was just presenting speaks to a lot of these questions. So So continuing on this concern with making sure that there's a clear understanding of where state protection can break down along what are often very complex and evolving routes. What roles do non-state actors play along these routes? There are many challenges, there are many vulnerabilities. Lauda mentioned several of them. So smugglers, community leaders. How are the different non-state actors playing a role along these chains? And so this is something that detailed research at scale can help answer. There are basic dynamics that are important to understand as well. So what differentiates the decision to migrate at first from onward movement? So do people have this similar level of aspirations as they go on and knock on each of the multiple doors that they're going to face throughout this chain? They're going to be exposed to several shocks, a lot of instability, a lot of uncertainty. Is that going to reshape their intentions mid-route? If you're just doing research at origin and at destination, you're going to miss this complexity, and then you won't understand, you won't have a full picture of how people are making decisions and why. The issues related to smuggling, trafficking, and just risk navigation. So when and how does exploitation emerge along the route? How smuggling networks adapt to enforcement. So again, this point, as Lauda was mentioning in the research, of there might be surprising ways in which smuggling networks are going to respond to enforcement attempts in different countries. And so unless you keep up with real-time research and data collection, you will be blind to these changes and potential displacement of smuggling dynamics, perhaps even to riskier paths. Another very important point, pursuing this concern with trying to understand how migrants are making decisions, is what type of information are they making their decisions on? So how do they access information along the route? It's not just at origin, but along the route, they're going to be updating their the information and their choices, their understanding of their choices and their options. What role does misinformation or rumor play? So how do their aspirations and the level of information that they hold on the different risks that they are exposed to, how does that change along each stage of travel? I would also mention the very important point of return and reintegration. So what happens after return from countries? Are the integration programs reaching the returnees along the route? What are the long-term outcomes of failed migration? Their concerns with the stigma, if you're perceived by your community as having failed on your migration objectives. So how are people perceiving these challenges, and whether or not they are accessing any reintegration programs that can mitigate them? There's also the concern between migration and local development. So how does migration affect local economies and transit hubs? Again, if you're just focusing on origin and destination research, you're missing this big chunk in the middle, which is what's happening to these transit hubs where the majority of migrants are likely to be dwelling in. So are humanitarian interventions aligned with local development plans? These things are often at odds, but timely research and good data collection can help align these incentives and align these strategies between humanitarian support to migrants with just local development needs. And this can perhaps even facilitate the integration of the migrants themselves while en route. So how can we answer all these questions? Well, exactly the way Lauda has been doing with her research. Obviously, what is key to be able to answer any of these important questions is to strengthen having comparative data along the different routes. So Lauda mentioned there's some similarities across routes, but there are also many differences. It's important to have longitudinal data, so data across time, not just a snapshot in a given moment in time, but understanding how these dynamics are evolving across time. It's critical to be able to collect data at scale. If data are collected from just small settings or small pilots, then obviously it's harder to think about how to generalize the patterns that we are observing in the data. An important part of this, given the complexity of the issues and the scale of the data collection effort, not only for collection, but also then for analysis. Some of these partnerships between researchers and policymakers can be key. Otherwise, policy can again just risk being blind to these fast evolving dynamics and having many blind spots. So why does it matter to do this root-based research at scale? Because there's the complexity of the issue. There are many gaps in the official data. So migration along these routes is very dynamic. It's often irregular. And that cannot be captured by traditional data systems that tend to be country-based. There are many different drivers, as Laura was highlighting in her presentation. There are concerns about flare-ups and conflict, their climate, which could be long-term or short-term shocks, their changes in smuggling networks, their gender-based risks. All of these are going to intersect in a way that makes it very hard to understand what is driving migration and what are the current patterns of migration. And research, timely research with adequate data can help kind of untangle all of these different drivers and better be able to track them. And importantly, to try to anticipate change. So only having can help us understand what might be unintended effects of policies and what might be emerging risks for vulnerable populations. So I will just one last slide on mentioning the potential of artificial intelligence to help us improve route-based migration research. So there are many ways in which AI can assist in this endeavor. One is to help design early warning systems. So AI models, once you have adequate data, can detect anomalies and forecast migration surges by just analyzing existing mobility data. It can analyze at scale and very quickly weather shocks, conflict patterns. So it can help us promote or develop these early warning systems. It can also better help us understand changes in the smuggling network. So by using network analysis together with machine learning techniques or natural language processing methods, it can leverage a variety of data from social media to other sources that can help us better identify what are the current routes, who are the current actors at play, and what is the online smuggling activity that is taking place that is feeding into these dynamics. It also allows us to do more real-time route monitoring. So AI-powered tools can process satellite imagery, they can process social media data as well, or mobile phone data to try to track evolving movement across the different corridors. And lastly, it can help us also in improving the targeting of support, because machine learning can also help us segment migrants by their risk profile or by their observed vulnerabilities to try to improve the delivery of protection or aid. So how can all of this be done? Well, going back to Laura's earlier point of this co-production of research between policymakers and researchers, obviously the funding and the prioritization of this field-based data collection on route-based research projects, also supporting national data systems and disaggregated migration data that can be leveraged to better understand migration dynamics, and then obviously trying to better translate all these findings into kind of accessible policy briefs that can have impact on migration policy. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to more questions and more discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you, Laura, for your fantastic presentations. Colleagues, you've had a whirlwind tour of our next generation of migration research presented by Laura, and then a fantastic complementary presentation on why this all matters by Sandra. So it's almost like we planned it that way. And now there's 10 minutes for some questions and answers. I see we already have one question in the chat and we have one hand up. So Daniel, I'll give you the floor to ask your question, and then I'll take the second question as a question in the chat. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you. That was excellent. I really appreciate you putting this all together. My first question is for Laura, and how did you factor in gender in your designing of the questions? I know DTM is very thoughtful in the designing of questions, but how did you factor in gender assumptions, for example, knowing that it's mostly men on these routes? How do you even look at approaching women to get that perspective? So that extremely interested in that. And then how did you integrate sex and gender analysis into your approach? I can hold the next question, or and then I'll just tell. Okay, so Sandra, for you, the question is, you talked about smugglers along the route, and I'm interested in the bridge that happens from in transit to destination, where sometimes the smugglers become part of that process as well. And we're talking about mostly groups who are outside the asylum system. So I use the integration. So in those cases, do you find that the smugglers are that bridge in destination countries as well? That's it. Thank you.
Laura, maybe you can take the first question, and then Sandra the second.
Thank you so much, Daniel and all. Well, first of all, basically, as a starter, there were no many female available or accessible, or notwithstanding that, as you know, we recruit female enumerators in order to allow that better trust and sharing of information. Some, they were not en route because there were less female traveling overall, as mentioned. So anyway, the sample was by necessity not being a gender-focused research, but rather looking at the broader migration narrative and decision-making process. That said, so we have very interesting gender-related findings, and we identified the gender pattern of migration along all the routes that I mentioned a bit about the one on the eastern route, but also along the southern route was fascinating because the communities with men on the southern Ethiopia, where men were mostly, all of them, traveling south for this very strong network migration dynamics that they had with this in Johannesburg, as well as in other big cities in Southern Africa. Female, they were traveling to Saudi Arabia. So from the same communities, men were getting down, and the females, they were going to Saudi Arabia. And when you were interviewing them, many of them, they were saying, we don't want to get married, otherwise we will have to get married, and then start. And rather than, we would like also to try our own journey, or to try, to have our own life choices. And that's why in the same communities, we had females that were trying to go as domestic workers, because again, the labor demand is highly gendered also for Saudi Arabia as compared to the labor opportunities in South Africa. The case, for instance, in Sudan, where we conducted the field phase for our Northern Route research, that being more mixed in nature, because there were already many of them, they were conflict affected, coming from, as I said, there was Tigray, but there was also the war of independence between Eritrea and Ethiopia, because many of the refugee camps in Sudan, traced back decades ago, they were more households, meaning that they were already, the whole family had escaped. And so again, there were different needs and expectations, anyway, yes, it was fascinating to see how gender was coming up across the various findings, although not specifically the research question in many of these questions.
Yes, great. Thank you, Daniel. So this is an incredibly difficult question. It is a very important one. We don't have fantastic data on how these smuggling networks operate worldwide. I think most of the evidence that exists suggests that they will be cross-national, and that they are kind of working together at different points along the chain. In fact, not just cross-national, but even intercontinental. So there's a rising trend of, for instance, Chinese, African, Pakistani migrants now trying to make it to the US through the Darien Gap route. So this clearly has to be something that is done at scale. And I think these networks are likely to operate in very sophisticated ways by integrating different steps of the chain, but in coordination amongst themselves. So this makes the problem harder because obviously then the response has to be cross-national as well. So it involves more of a response that's coordinated across many jurisdictions and many countries, which makes it harder. But I think the suspicion is that, yes, these are kind of well-oiled machines that are integrating across countries.
Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you, Nikki.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay, so we have one question in the chat, and then we'll take the hands that are in order. So we'll go for the question in the chat, which is, I think, directed towards you, Laura. Based on your route-based research, what are the main protection risks faced by Somali migrants and returnees along the key migratory corridors in the region?
Thank you so much. Somali, so let's say that along the eastern routes, those moving irregularly, so those going through Obok in Djibouti or Bosaso in Puntland, Somalia, and then crossing with the boat to Yemen, the Somali are less than 10%. Most of them, as mentioned, Ethiopian. In the case of the southern route, Somali are mostly flying. Most of them are flying to neighboring country of South Africa, where they have enjoyed visa-free regime, and they would just do the last leg through smuggler or regularly. And again, that was quite interesting because when we launched the northern route phase in Sudan, we wanted to also to include Somali as part of our sample. And so we were doing the scoping phase in Khartoum, in Al Fasha, in Kassala, and we were, for sure, we were targeting Eritrea, that are part of our study, Ethiopian. We were also looking at Sudanese in terms of aspiring migrants on the move. We couldn't find Somali. What does it mean? It was very hard to identify. We were in contact with different Somali diaspora or migrant group association, but it's clear that they were using different routes or different smuggling network. There are many Somali also going to Egypt and also staying to Egypt. And then, of course, we know there are also different Somali on the move on the central Mediterranean route. But again, usually even tending to use different smuggling network than the other migrant nationalities that I have mentioned. Overall, these are oversimplification that should really be taken with a pinch of salt. Let's say that overall they have more resources than the Ethiopian in order to engage in this type of journeys and so on. And that also translates in the types of how long the journey can take and the quality of the smuggler and the assistance, such as food and water. But that also, so that to put better things in context, along the eastern route was clearly that the Tigrayan, so Ethiopian Tigrayan, had far better smugglers and services compared to the Oromo. The Oromo is far lower, so that translated in terms of using sometimes car or buses in order to do some leg of the journey, translated in terms of food to eat, before boarding the boat, embarking to cross to Yemen. So this is to say that overall, of course, this is a hyper simplification. Then risk in terms of abuses, dehydration, risk of death, disappearances. This is in this irregular journey. I mean, they're kind of, unfortunately, very common. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so I think given the time, I think we'll try to take, we have 3 questions left. We'll see if there's time to take all 3, but we'll start with Arif. Your hand is up.
Thank you so much, Nikki and Sandra and Lara. I'm from Afghanistan. I work with DTM here as an manager. Uh, I have one. I want to ask from you about here in Afghanistan the situation with borders like Pakistan and Afghanistan, Iran. Nowadays, there is a bad situation. How do you think about these kind of uh, action there is started in border? There is no good facilities for the immigration peoples and with to the communities. Why you don't take action about here in Afghanistan? This is not related to this your meeting, but I want to ask from you why here there is no any action about the immigration people.
Hi, Arif. Thank you so much for that question. It's indeed a very big one and a very important one. I think this is something that maybe we need to address in a bilateral communication. But Laura, what do you think?
Yeah, totally. I would take the last question, and then maybe Sandra and I can give some final remarks. One for AI. Sandra, you must reply to the question in the chat. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you so much,
Thank you.
Arif. We'll have to address your question in a bilateral communication. So, Reinfred, your hand is up.
Thank you. My name is Rainfred from Ghana, a student of migration and security, a PhD candidate. My question has to do with where do we draw the line between environmentally induced migration and conflict-driven migrants, considering the case of South Sudan? I do agree that the factors that influence migration, there's a confluence of factors. But in the case of South Sudan, is it just an isolated cause or an interconnected cause in the case of South Sudan? Thank you.
Laura, is this a question you'd like to address?
Best to Sandra. Thank you so much in terms of the AI.
The conflict versus climate, right? So, so I think this is a great question. In fact, I think in practice, it's often hard to disentangle what is is conflict the driver or is climate change the driver? Because obviously, for climate change, you might have a climate shock, and that will push people out immediately. Or you might have kind of the kind of slow moving onset of climate problems from drought that might persist for a couple of years or even decades, and then that will push people eventually to go. And so I think this speaks exactly to the point of having good data that we can leverage on both the occurrence of conflict, but also understanding changes in weather patterns across, emerging that the decisions that people are making, and through these survey work to try to understand how are people perceiving the different vulnerabilities and the different risks, and that will be the only way for us to better understand: is it conflict, or is it climate, or is it the interaction between the two? That if you have a flare-up in conflict during a period of extended drought, then that's when people decide to move. So I think these are exactly the type of questions that can be answered through this type of route-based research. Now, I haven't looked specifically at the South Sudan context, but this is how I would think about it: is just gathering the data and trying to hear from people, why are they moving, what are the perceived risks, and so on. And so very quickly, thanks also for the question in the chat, which I think is fantastic. I'm glad it came up. So I'm a strong believer that AI can help us better kind of monitor, forecast, and respond to migration movements. But it should be seen as a complement to what is currently done with the route-based research, not as a substitute, and it cannot be deployed mindlessly. So it is something that will allow us to answer the questions that Reinfred was asking, of being able to very quickly look and analyze the conflict data at scale, analyze weather data at scale. So these are things that AI can do quite quickly that would be hard to do with traditional research tools. tools, but we need to make sure that there are guardrails in place in terms of who gets access to the data, how the data are used, and there needs to be a strong element of interpretation of the data, which again allows us, in light of all the research that has been done in the past, the way we understand migrants' decisions, and through qualitative research as well, so that we can better understand some of the answers that AI will try to provide. So it's critical that AI is used in a very smart way for it to be effective, but just not deployed mindlessly while you're just trying to look at data at scale, but without having a deep understanding of the context when you're trying to interpret some of those results. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sandra, for those comprehensive answers to some really big questions there. And thank you all for your attention and for your super interesting questions. It's been lovely to be here with you today, and I hope you have a nice day ahead. So I think we can close there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much again.
Thanks,
Please read the
everyone.
research when you have time. Ciao.
Cheers. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.